My decision to just stop off and see the result. Hey, it's
Good, yourself?
Great.
Good.
Yeah, it's being broadcast. Yeah. Live broadcast. You can, yeah. These guys can set you up. Yeah.
Sure, great. I'm Michael. Love to get our team. Sweet. We still have to do these two things.
Yeah, we don't have tech support in here, so it's likely that that's the best way to hear.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Just check. Everyone's got their headphones on. It's a silent disco style press conference. So yeah, you all okay? It's channel 0. Check the volume, maybe. Yeah, we have to wear the headphones or you can't hear. All the audio is through the headphones. Great. Okay, excellent. We'll kick off, assuming most people can hear me. Hello, welcome. Thanks very much for coming. My name's Tom Brooks from the European Climate Foundation. I'm chairing this press conference today. And with us we have Michael Jacobs, representing the Commission on the New Climate Economy, Monica Araya, from the think tank Nivela, based in Costa Rica, and expert advisor to the Climate Vulnerable Forum. We have Jennifer Morgan, who's the director of the Climate Program at the World Resources Institute, and Thomas Spencer, director of climate at IDDRI, based in Paris. And with that, if everyone's sorry, we're just sorting out a few last headphones. Okay, I think is everyone? There's a box of headphones back there, if you need them. And obviously, there's one large caveat on this whole question, which is we have the text as it currently stands, not as it's finally adopted. And so this is analysis and commentary on the text as it currently stands. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see the exact shape in which it's adopted. Although we'll take it that this should at least be some indication. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think if this is adopted as it currently stands, that countries have united around a historic agreement that marks a turning point in the climate crisis. I'm going to cover a couple of issues that are in the text around the long-term goal and the solidarity package, we'll call it that. So I think the long-term goal, basically what is has been captured in article currently now 4.1, is not only the peaking as soon as possible, but basically that countries would achieve a net zero emissions by the second half of this century. What the text does is actually utilize language, scientific language, from the UNFCCC inventories to describe what is a balance between sources and sinks. What the implications of that are for greenhouse gas emissions. If it's a 2 degrees world, you're looking at net zero between 2080 and 2090. If it's a 1.5 degrees world, you're looking at 2060 to 2080. This is a transformational long-term goal that really should send clear signals into the markets, and I think can bring science to the heart of this agreement. If I turn to the issues besides finance, which Monica will cover, around issues that I think were particularly important for developing countries, our read right now is that the adaptation article has been strengthened, that you have an adaptation cycle here, you have a global goal on adaptation, a cycle. All countries are bound to do adaptation planning. This just recognizes the importance of risks. The stock take is stronger than it was before, which is quite important as well. And on loss and damage, you see a separate article on loss and damage. You see the Warsaw mechanism coming in. Its scope has been expanded. You see in the decision a task force on displacement, and also in the decision that this Warsaw mechanism does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So very focused on the Warsaw mechanism provisions around that. So that concludes.
Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Michael Jacobs.
So welcome everybody. One of the most interesting things I think about the period before this conference was the engagement of the business and investor community with the climate change issue. And in a rather remarkable development, a very large number of business and investor organizations started saying what they wanted out of this agreement. What they wanted was a signal about the way the future economy would be shaped. A signal for those of them who were looking to invest more in low carbon technologies and systems and production, that the world was on an irreversible, irrevocable downward trend of emissions, and that if they put their investments into low carbon technologies, they would make more money than if they put them into high carbon assets. Now, you will no doubt want to ask people, but in my position as an advisor to the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which argued the same thing, that this was effectively what we needed was an economic signal from this agreement, I think this is rather remarkable. We have here a long-term goal, which is for net zero emissions in the second half of the century, a very clear trajectory of where the global economy is going. And we have a mechanism of 5-year cycles, which means that synchronized, at least in the sense of the cycle, every country in the world will now bear down on its emissions. So policy is now all going in the same direction. And that means, because we're doing it globally, that the global markets will be larger. So my reaction to this document, if it is adopted, is that this sends a very powerful signal to the world's markets. We have here a very strong legal basis for the commitments. In Article 4, parties shall not only prepare, communicate and maintain their successive nationally determined contributions, but they shall pursue domestic measures with the aim of achieving the objectives of these. So this is about as strong a legal basis for these contributions as can be found, and they will represent a progression. It's a clear 5-year cycle, and it has been strengthened since the last draft. So the first stage of the cycle will now occur in 2018 in decision text paragraph 20, not 2019, which it was a couple of days ago. So an earlier stock take of where we are, and then the first round of contributions efforts will be in 2020, as it was, but the language has been a little bit strengthened. We're now urging countries that have 2025 targets to produce new ones, and requesting countries that have 2030, parties that have 2030 targets to update or recommunicate. So we have already in this agreement, one of the key things that many people came into this to say we need to start this early, and we can't simply say that what we've got on the table now in the INDCs is finished. There should be floors to ambition, not ceilings. And that is very clearly there in those parts of the decision text. And then in the agreement text, you have the beginnings of the full 5-year cycle, the stock take in 2023, now, as Jennifer says, covering everything, mitigation, adaptation, finance, and then the first round of the next, contributions under the agreement in 2025, and then every 5 years. So this is an incredibly strong architecture of legally binding rules to require every country to do this over successive 5-year periods. And the other thing I just wanted to comment on is the transparency framework. We do have in this agreement a very clear single transparency framework that applies to all parties, including a single system of verification, and one which gives flexibility to developing countries to adopt the system and provide support for the least developed and developing countries to do this. So this is a remarkable thing that we have now, a common system of transparency. And it's binding. This is a binding, single transparency system.
Thank you very much, Michael. If I may hand over to Monica Araya.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to start by saying that if the text survives, it will send a very strong signal to everybody, but it will send a very strong signal to developing countries, especially the ones who are ready to make a decoupling of development and fossil fuels. So the signal is there, and we should celebrate it because it is in our best interest to decarbonize our economies. Before I get into finance, which is the topic I wanted to comment, I wanted to celebrate that the reference to 1.5 is there, is mentioned, is alive and kicking in the social media, is winning hearts and minds, and this is a cause for celebration because it means we are changing. I also wanted to emphasize that the signal that we're getting here is that even though developed countries have to leave, and they have to leave, we are on a common trajectory, and this is about signaling this common direction. So in terms of Article 9, I wanted to say a few things because, as you know, I was a climate finance negotiator in the past, and there are elements here that were unthinkable a few years back. So rather than going into chapter 9 into all the details, I wanted to capture some elements that give you a flavor of that kind of new realities that are bringing here, that are kicking in here. As you can imagine, and those of you who have been tracking finance, the first paragraph is key, and it's a strong paragraph. It basically highlights that developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties with respect to mitigation and adaptation in continuation of their existing obligations under the convention. This is a very important paragraph. But I also wanted to highlight the second one because this is key for making the transition. And it basically highlights that there will be a pathway of financing flows to developing countries from developing countries. This is new. This is one idea that would have been unthinkable when I was a negotiator. And of course, because of the politics and because we are in a transition, it is here with language and is voluntary. But what I wanted to highlight is that we are starting to walk on a different path. I also wanted to highlight a point that many developing countries have made, regardless of whether they are from Africa, Asia, or Latin America. And it is the point that we have to have more political parity between adaptation and mitigation. So you will find that in paragraph 4. It is formal, it is there, and it is something that developing countries see as a very important element of this article. Another point that has been won here is that there will be indicative, quantitative, and qualitative information reports. And the context for this is that developing countries were often in disadvantage because they did not know how much money they would get in future periods, and that hurt their planning. So having this in paragraph 5 is also a very important thing. And as Michael and Jennifer mentioned, finance is now part of the global stocktake. You might find that perhaps some elements are a bit messy or difficult to understand, but it is there, and that is also a very good thing. And finally, the paragraph that talks about simplified approval procedures. Again, it may not be like, it will never make the headlines, but I also wanted to highlight that it is operationally a very important thing for this country. So I'm going to stop here and I might have to leave. That's okay.
It's proving a rather chaotic. You've got another 15 minutes. Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Tom. It's a real pleasure to be here. If adopted as it is today, this agreement is far above the lowest common denominator agreement and is an indication of multilateralism. There were two equilibrium in this negotiation. The first one was a lowest common denominator, weak agreement. And I have to say that in October, when the ADP co-chairs presented their draft text, this was where we were headed. The other was a high ambition equilibrium, where the tension between each of the elements held the whole thing together. And this is the agreement that we have here today. There were a confluence of factors that brought this about. We had a very strong engagement from heads of state at the start of the conference. We had courageous engagement, I would say, from India and China to go beyond the traditional opposition between development and climate action. We had the voice of the vulnerable countries being heard much more strongly and precisely than we have had before in this negotiation, starting with the Climate Vulnerable Forum and ending with the High Ambition Coalition between the EU, the US, in the end Brazil, and tens of vulnerable countries. We had the French presidency, its political courage, and I would highlight in particular the importance of its technical knowledge. This kind of high ambition agreement where each of the parts of the agreement are so finely balanced that it can hold together couldn't have been done without this knowledge. And finally, we've had civil society come together from around the world, from the climate marches to years and years of engagement in this process on the ground. This agreement would keep the foot on the pedal. It would keep tension in the system. It would continue to drive ambition on mitigation, on finance, and on the initiatives that we have seen announced here. Because with this 5-year cycle of important political moments where we take new action, of course, countries will come back to the table, but these initiatives will also come back to the table to show what they've done on innovation, technology, finance, and business engagement. I said at the start this was a vindication of multilateralism, and I really believe this. What we have seen is countries come here together and their individual demands have combined to push the collective response beyond what a single country or group of countries would have asked for. And in that sense, there have been many who have condemned this process for being too slow, but I think we have the proof here that a multilateral response to climate change is what we need, and it's what we have here today.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Right, we're now going to take questions.
Seth Borenstein, AP. I guess it would be helpful if Jennifer was still here. Maybe Michael or someone could get this. In terms of the carbon net zero, it doesn't technically say net zero, it talks about a balance. Is there a difference between balance and net zero? And, you know, that's what's kind of surprising. Everyone says net zero, this says balance. Is that a difference? And then also, when does this have us peak for 1.5 and 2.0? It just talks about peaking emissions, but no date. Do we have a date for peaking emissions?
So, a balance, if you picture a balance, the two parts of the balance are equal. And the balance is between emissions and removals, sources and sinks. What's interesting about this is that they have found science-based language to express this concept. As you may know, in the last draft, it said greenhouse gas emissions neutrality. And quite a lot of you and quite a lot of countries said, well, what's that? And here they found a way of expressing this concept of net zero emissions in the language of the IPCC and indeed of the UNFCCC of emissions and removal sources and sinks. But it does mean that the emissions and the removals are equivalent, balanced, and that is the concept of net zero. So this is, in my view, a strengthening of the language here. This roots this agreement in the science. Remember why we're here. We're here because the scientists gathered together in the IPCC have been telling us over many years, the last time in 2013, 2014, with the fifth assessment report, that we had to reduce emissions to zero. And the last assessment report made this very clear, that in order to stabilize the temperature, you have to get emissions down to zero. That's actually true at any temperature stabilization. If you want to do it to 2 degrees, you have to do it in the second half of the century. To peak emissions for 2 degrees, now it all depends on the bend of the curve. And the earliest part is the part where you've got the most leeway, but it depends on the bends of the curve. This has to be done by around 2020. The 1.5 peak is not much different because it's really the acceleration of the trend after the peak. It's the acceleration downwards that gets you close to 1.5. So the peaking is not dramatically affected by the temperature goal. The pace, the acceleration of emissions reduction after that is what is the difference. And what we will now see in the stock takes is 2 emissions gaps. We will see, I think, the analysts producing an emissions gap to a 2-degree pathway and an emissions gap to the 1.5-degree pathway. And what this agreement does by having both temperature goals in there is to increase the pressure on governments, and policymakers, and the business sector and the technology innovators to accelerate emissions reduction. That's a rather remarkable aspect of this agreement, which frankly, most of us coming in here did not think we would see.
Thanks very much. Michael, next question over here.
Jonathan Leake here from Sunday Times. So I can't see any reference in the current text to either aviation or shipping. I wondered if you could comment on that. But more broadly, there's any number of projects around the world to build power stations, airports, harbours, whatever. In Britain, we've got the proposal to build a new runway at Heathrow, for example, and our own energy minister has proposed building a new raft of gas-fired power stations. What kind of effect might this agreement have on people's willingness to invest in those kinds of projects and the wisdom of even proposing them or investing in them at all?
Thomas, do you want to take go and then Michael?
Sure. So on aviation and shipping, yes, effectively the language has dropped out. I think that's a shame, but we do have agreement that we should try and reach an agreement on a market-based system for addressing aviation emissions in 2016. So those processes are still on the road under ICAO and IMO, and I think this agreement can only strengthen them. On the second part of your question, as Michael said, this agreement sends an economic signal that domestic policy will be strengthened over time in a coordinated and collective way. And I think we saw after the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, companies started to make economic decisions factoring in a price of carbon. After Copenhagen, many companies started to think that the world would let up on its efforts on climate change. And I think this agreement can reverse that trend. And I think we'll see that in the boardroom discussions in the next months, in share prices. And it really does send a very strong signal that both national policy and international collaboration will be strengthened, that this issue is not going away.
Thanks very much, Thomas.
Yes, very quickly. I know your question was in the context of the UK, but I wanted to add something about developing countries, because the public debate has been very focused on the cost of doing renewables, and we have now an agreement that will force a conversation on the benefits of doing these projects, but also, and that is where 1.5 matters too, it will force a conversation of how complacent we've been in underestimating the risk that infrastructure faces in a 2-degree world. So for example, if you talk to visionary people who are thinking about this in Latin America, the conversation they will want to have, and they have said it, some of them, is resilient ports. So it's no longer the 20th century question of, oh, should we do renewables? Isn't that too expensive? It is a very transformative conversation which we should have. And if in the UK, if you don't have it, you will be hurt. It's not just us in the developing world that will be hurt. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have a next question here. I just also need to mention that Monica needs to leave in about 5 minutes.
Yes, thanks, Tom. This is Steve Kerwood here from Living on Earth Public Radio International. 2 questions for you, and I wish Jennifer were here as well. Colleague said.
Sorry about that.
One is a procedural one. It's unusual to see all the big dogs come out before this is promulgated at the COP. So, is there an opportunity for debate in the Committee of the Whole, the Committee of Paris? Is there the opportunity coming up for debate when the COP finally comes together? What are the odds that the chair could be challenged on the agreement here? And the other question is, I'm not quite clear in my mind which part of this calls for recognition of refugee status in extreme loss and damage. Neither in the decision or in the agreement does it mention who would have the power or when those steps would be taken for folks to be declared refugees when the worst happens.
Thanks very much for those questions. Who would like to have a go at the process questions? Thomas.
Yeah, so it's quite normal for the text to be presented in the way it was, then for time to be given to read it, and then for it to be subsequently adopted in the COP plenary. I think the fact that we saw President Hollande here today, obviously Laurent Fabius has been presiding these 2 weeks, is merely a signal that this really is a historic agreement. And it's also an indicator of to what extent the heads of state have been involved. These 2 weeks at the start, and during the 2 weeks, and including last night, obviously on the phone, but also over the last 2 years. This has been a process that has been driven by heads of state engagement, in particular since the New York summit. So, this process has its risks. Nothing is guaranteed, but I think we can feel confident that the agreement will be adopted today, and that Hollande's presence was really a sign of to what extent this is historic and has been driven by the highest political level.
Thanks, Dawes. Did you want to add something? Because you're going to have to get.
I'd like to go back to your question about refugees because this is very important for many countries. And even though it's not mentioned here explicitly, if you look at Article 8, Paragraph 4, what it says is that there will be cooperation on areas, but it is not limited to these areas, and there is nothing preventing countries from having this conversation because, as you point out, it's something that is in the air and it will become increasingly relevant next year. So thank you for bringing the question up.
Thanks a lot, Monica.
So there is no mention of refugees. It's not a term that's used here. As Monica says, Article 8 does not mention this. Decision text Article 50 sets up a task force to look at integrated approaches to avert, minimise and address displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change. So it's acknowledged that displacement may occur and there will be a process set up to look at it. That's the most that it's done.
Okay, thanks very much. Question here.
Hi, Ian from Caixin Media in China. Actually, I have a question for Monica, but she left. But okay, and maybe Michael and Thompson can help. Monica speaks very high of the finance article in the agreement, but I'm wondering what happened to the pre-2020 finance arrangement. Personally, still haven't seen a very clear roadmap. Does it mean that developing countries have traded for something else, maybe transparency in the text?
I think that the financial provisions are strong. So first of all, we established the 100 billion goal as the floor from 2020. There are provisions that would get increasing scrutiny of what is being reported as climate change finance, and this has been a key call from developing countries that we want to have scrutiny and rules on what is reported on climate change finance. And the third part of the package was that we would gradually scale up from $100 billion from 2020 in the context of a collective effort. And that is there as well. So I really think that we've seen extraordinary evolutions on finance this year with the Financial Stability Board, the chief regulator of the global financial sector, adopting standards for disclosure on climate risk, with multilateral development banks coming to the table with extra funding, governments coming forward. And reading these paragraphs, I'm convinced that this agreement will keep up the pressure on that. Because with this scrutiny, and with the 100 billion as a floor, we will have to find ways of providing money that is transparent, that is effective, and that is transformational. So I think actually it's quite a strong financial package.
Thanks very much. For any further questions? Yeah, right here.
Michael or Tom?
It's all the economy. So I wondered if there was anything that you'd single out as something you particularly liked in the Thursday draft that isn't in the final agreement.
Struggling, and I'm struggling actually to think. We've just been through the text, we've done comparison. Most of the things that we thought would be weakened have been strengthened. And so at this moment, I don't think there is.
No, I would agree with you. I think we need to be clear that the agreement leaves a lot to be developed technically afterwards, so there will be a lot of work afterwards. But that is the nature of a long-term legal agreement. We need the key provisions in a core text that can be there forever. So there will be a lot of work, but I think between Thursday and today there has not been much change.
And any other questions? No, I'm not seeing any hands going up. Okay, great. Well, look, thank you very much for making the time. Very busy afternoon. And yeah, have a good remainder of the COP. Thanks.